So, hey, everybody, it's me, Michael Moreci. I am coming to you from Kentucky today. I'm at the Soki Book Fest. Southern Kentucky is what that means. This is the second day. Yesterday was the teen day, which was awesome. There's lots of very enthusiastic readers, which was super cool and super fun. I love seeing that. But also yesterday, I gave a talk, a workshop on sci-fi world building, sci-fi and fantasy world building, and I figure I'd share some of that today. It won't be as long because that was over an hour, and I'm not going to talk at everyone for over an hour. That was a little bit more interactive, so it's just me. I'm going to talk a little about that. I have my screen here that I'm going to use for reference, but so we're going to talk briefly. I'm going to boil it down to some important, essential things that I think about when I think about world building. So as you probably know, world building is like this like big like buzzword that everyone talks about when you talk about like genre. It's like what is the world building, and everyone's kind of grading the world building and what it does and what it functions. And I think it's kind of a little bit of BS. Because I think it's been given more merit and more importance than it really is. And I think you can get lost in the idea of world building. But I think the most essential thing to think about, first of all, you think about like what are your favorite worlds. I think it's a good idea to get a grasp on what your favorite worlds are and how they function, because there's a wide variety of worlds and how they work and what they do. And I'm not just talking about like the differences between Tatooine and Middle Earth. Like that's just like details and stuff like that. I'm talking about how they function in story, and that's the main thing we're going to talk about is story. So if you're looking at something like Star Wars, which my reference for everything. If I can't, I make breakfast. I'm like, what would Star Wars do? But like, so we're talking about like just this function of like what the world is doing in this story. Star Wars, for example, Star Wars is something that keeps it very, very simple. Like Star Wars is world building, which I think is great, which I think is perfect, and we'll talk about more about serving story. But Star Wars is something that keeps it simple. There's forest planets, and there's ice planets, and there's desert planets, and like it's pretty clean. The way they do things is pretty neat, and that's totally fine. It's totally functional. But if you look at something like Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, the world building is a lot more vast. It's a lot bigger. It's a lot more expansive. You're getting history and politics and regions and maps, and you're getting a lot of stuff in that series. As if you've read all, I don't know how many pages it amount to. I think about 10 million. But if you've read it all, there's a lot of stuff going on, in particularly for the world. So think about those things. Think about like not just about the details of the world. Think about the differences between like how a world is functioning to story. And that is the number one thing that I touched on yesterday, that I always touch on when I talk about these kind of things. The most important thing, the most vital key thing that you want to do in anything, and particularly to world building, is think about how this is serving the story. Like, what is this doing for your story? Everything that you do in your book, in your screenplay, in your comic, whatever, is going to be in service of the story. That is the first thing, and I always like stress that. Our brains are hardwired for story. We recount the events of our days in a narrative. We meet friends at the bar and we talk about things that happen and we put it into a narrative, and we edit out the boring stuff and we highlight the important things, the highlights of what we want to say and do, and we end up putting that in a sequence of events, and that is a narrative, and that is a story. And when you're looking at world building, it's how is it serving the story. And I find that so many people, when they're looking at world building, get caught up in these really, really extensive details of the world and all these histories. And I actually was talking to a guy yesterday after the class, and he was telling me this like great story he had in this vast story, and it was all this backstory. It was all this backstory that led to like he was more or less ending the book where it should begin. Like where this is where the conflict is. This is where your story starts. This is when you're, I'm gonna move the screen. It's kind of getting a little wonky with that. But he's like, this is where your main character, your protagonist, is getting agency. The rest, it's great that you know those things, and it's like this big, cool world that you have, and I liked it. But like, you find yourself getting too lost in the world, too many details, and that is a path of treachery for your story, because like you start just having, you look at like Tolkien. Tolkien's a great example I brought up yesterday. he has Middle Earth. Tolkien create a language. Like he created like so much world building. He made his own language. The books that are ancillary to Lord of the Rings are just basically like world building. There's some stories in there, but mostly it's just world building and like what happened in histories and again maps and what's happening in this area of Middle Earth, what's happening in that area of world Middle Earth, and the histories of these characters and legacies and lineages and stuff like that. And I say this loving Tolkien, I say this loving Lord of the Rings. None of those things, nobody would care about any of them. None of them without Lord of the Rings. Without the simple story of a hobbit has a ring, and it's a powerful ring, and there's an evil dude who wants it, and if he doesn't throw it into lava, then the evil dude's going to get it and control Middle Earth, and it's going to be terrible. There's a lot more to it, obviously. But without that simple hero's journey and the relationships between Sam and Frodo and Aragorn's rise to reclaiming his kingship and, all the other things that are going on, these wonderful, rich world, these characters and the story, all those things are what makes Lord of the Rings powerful. The language is cool. Like, that's awesome. But nobody would care about Elvish if it wasn't for that story. So you have to serve the story first and foremost. And story, obviously, we can talk, there's a lot more you can say about story and how that functions and structure and everything like that. And I'm going to go into that in different, videos and stuff that I, do. But right now we're talking about worlds. And the thing that I cautioned yesterday, I caution now, is make sure that what you do is in service to, first and foremost, the story. Make it about the story. Make the world fit into the tapestry of the story. Star Wars, again, it's a pretty simple story. Especially New Hope in particular. It's a hero's journey. You know enough about the world. What is the backstory of the world that you learn? You learn about like the Force. You know enough about the Force so it's functional. Like there is this thing called the Clone Wars, and there's this guy who's Obi-Wan, and he can do these sort of things with the Force, and he sort of trained Luke, so he gets good enough. So at the end, when he blows up the Death Star, that he uses the Force. You know enough of what the Force is. The Force has evolved since then, but you know enough that the world works. It makes sense. Like you look at like, again, going back to that whole the young guy that I talked to who had this whole big world and this whole big prologue, this whole like long rich thing that before you actually got to the story. Look at like how Star Wars starts. The crawl talks about the rebels have won a decisive victory. They captured these plans to a mega base, evil base, and now they're on the run. None of that has anything to do with the world. That's all story. That's all story. And then the world start, layer by layer, start get peeled away. You see Vader, you meet Leia, you go to Tatooine, you have the droids, you have Luke, you have Obi-Wan, you have all these things. And layer by layer, you start to learn enough about the story, enough about the world to function the story. These things are working in concert with one another. It's a tapestry where, you have story and character and stuff like that at top, and the world is serving all of that. You can get deeper. Like, again, you can get Robert Jordan with it. You can get Brandon Sanderson with that. But even someone like Brandon Sanderson, I would say his world functions very, very tight with the story. Nobody's better at closing circuits than Brandon Sanderson. The things he brings up about his world, and something like another example I use is Mistborn. You're introduced to this world that has a red sky and ashes falling from the sky, and the Lord Ruler is taken over, and these are all the stuff of what the world is. But all those details are wrapped up very, very nicely, and it's very tidy, and it all, again, is serving the story. So the thing that I would caution, I'm going to look at my notes really fast to make sure I'm not forgetting anything that I talked about. I could talk about my own experiences, but I can maybe do that another time. But for right now, the biggest thing that I would say is make sure that what you do in your world building is serving story. Don't get so caught up in that. Like first and foremost, you have to tell a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has to have a structure, has to have good characters, has to have a character who wants something. What do this person want? What does your character want? What is the journey? What is happening? That is the first thing. Worlds are important. I don't mean to diminish the importance of worlds, but I also want to caution not to get so caught up in that. And also look at how worlds function. Look how fast you want it to be. Look how simple you want it to be. And always have that tapestry, the story tapestry of everything working in concert with one another. You might create more of the world that doesn't end up on the page or the screen or whatever. You might end up doing that, and that's totally cool. It's good that you know those things. But just be judicious about what you put into there, how you build your world, and how it's serving your ultimate goal of making a compelling and rich story. And that's the best thing that you can do. So, Hopefully that's helpful. People seem to like it yesterday. That was nice. So anyway, I'm off. I have to go do another day at the Soki Book Fest. It's been great, and hope to talk to you guys all again very soon. Talk to you soon.